He believes you are barren." The words, spoken in a silken whisper by Lady Beatrice, were a drop of poison in the cloying sweetness of the ballroom. Eleonora, Duchess of Blackwood, did not flinch. She had learned not to. Outwardly, she was a statue of ivory and pearls, her posture perfect, her smile a fragile, painted thing. Inside, the acid of her husband's aunt's words began its slow work, eating away at the last frayed threads of hope she possessed. The air in the Blackwood townhouse was always heavy, thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and beeswax, but tonight it felt particularly suffocating. It was a physical weight pressing on her chest, a pressure that had been building for months. From across the room she saw him, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, her husband. He was a portrait of aristocratic perfection, tall and severe, his dark hair gleaming under the chandeliers. He was talking to a minister of the crown, his expression one of polite, detached interest. He had not looked at her, not truly, in weeks. Their marriage, now in its second year, was a masterpiece of societal performance, a union of a powerful, ancient title and a respectable, if less storied, fortune. It was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it had become a gilded cage, and the silence within it was deafening. Beatrice laid a cool, dry hand on Eleonora's arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "My dear, you must understand. The dukedom requires an heir. It is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of duty." Eleonora wanted to pull away, to scream that she had tried to speak to Alistair, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them almost from the first month. He was always occupied, always in meetings, always under the subtle, pervasive influence of the woman now squeezing her arm. Lady Beatrice had raised Alistair after his parents' early deaths, and her influence was a deeply rooted ivy, choking the life out of everything it touched. "I am aware of my duty, Lady Beatrice," Eleonora murmured, her voice a low counterpoint to the string quartet's cheerful tune. "Are you?" The older woman's eyes, a pale and chilling blue, raked over Eleonora's slender frame with unconcealed disdain. "A man like my nephew has needs and expectations. If his own wife cannot meet them, he may be forced to look elsewhere for fulfillment, and for a son." It was a threat, elegantly phrased but as brutal as a slap. Eleonora's stomach churned. For the past few weeks, a strange lethargy had clung to her, a faint nausea that came and went. She had dismissed it as a symptom of her unhappiness, a physical manifestation of the slow despair that was becoming her constant companion. Now a wild, terrifying thought bloomed in her mind. Could it be? She excused herself, her movements stiff. She needed air. She needed to escape the hundreds of judging eyes, the weight of the diamonds at her throat, the suffocating presence of her husband's aunt. She found her way to a small, deserted balcony, the cool night air a balm on her heated skin. The scent of damp earth and coming rain from the garden below was a relief after the cloying perfumes inside. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach. It was a foolish hope, a desperate, impossible dream. And yet, if it were true, what would it change? Would Alistair even believe it was his? The thought was so vile, so wounding, that it stole her breath. He had become a stranger to her, a remote figure who shared her name and her house, but not her life. His coldness was a wall she could no longer find the strength to scale. A few days later, the nausea returned, stronger this time. She was lacing her own corset, having dismissed her maid, when the world tilted violently. She gripped the bedpost, her knuckles white, breathing through the wave of sickness. It passed, leaving her trembling and slick with a cold sweat. It was true. She knew it with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating. A fierce protective instinct, hot and powerful, surged through her. This was not about the dukedom anymore. This was not about duty or Alistair or his venomous aunt. This was about the tiny, secret life she carried. Her child. The knowledge was a shield. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of strength. She had a purpose beyond enduring, Beyond surviving the elegant cruelty of her life, she had to protect this child. She decided to tell Alistair that evening. She would not allow Beatrice to be present. She would insist he meet her in the library after their silent, perfunctory dinner. She would tell him, and she would watch his face, and she would know in that moment if there was anything left of the man she had once thought she was marrying. But she never got the chance. As she descended the grand staircase for dinner, her hand resting lightly on the polished oak banister, she heard voices from the library. The door was ajar. It was Alistair and his aunt. "No other explanation," Beatrice was saying, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Alistair. I know how this must wound your pride." "My pride?" Alistair's voice was like chips of ice. "She has made a fool of me, in my own house." Eleonora froze, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "I found them in her writing desk," Beatrice continued, "tucked away in a volume of poetry. It is his handwriting, I am certain of it. That young artist she was so taken with before your engagement, Mr. Sterling." A cold dread washed over Eleonora. Julian Sterling was a painter of some small repute. She had admired his work, had even exchanged a few pleasant, formal letters with him about a possible commission for her father. The correspondence had been utterly innocuous. "Show me," Alistair commanded. There was a rustle of paper. Eleonora crept closer, her silk slippers making no sound on the marble floor. She peered through the crack in the door. Alistair stood by the fireplace, his back to her, a sheaf of letters in his hand. Lady Beatrice watched him, her face a mask of concern that did not quite reach her triumphant eyes. "The language is intimate," Beatrice murmured. "He speaks of stolen moments and a love that defies convention. It is sickening. To think she carried on with this under your very roof." Eleonora's blood ran cold. Stolen moments? A love that defies convention? It was a lie. A complete and utter fabrication. She had never seen Julian Sterling after her marriage. The letters were forgeries. They had to be. She watched as Alistair read. His shoulders were rigid. The silence stretched, thick with malice. Finally, he crumpled the pages in one fist, his knuckles stark white. He did not turn, did not speak for a long moment. He simply stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his polished boots. "She will be gone by morning," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was a flat, final judgment, a death sentence for their marriage, for her life. "I will not have an adulteress, and the bastard she is likely carrying, tainting the Blackwood name." The word hit her like a physical blow. Bastard. He had not only condemned her, but their child. Her child. The tiny, secret life she had only just begun to cherish. In that moment, something inside her shattered. It was not her heart. That had been slowly breaking for months. It was her hope. It was the foolish, lingering belief that the man she married still existed somewhere beneath the cold facade of the Duke. She saw it all with horrifying clarity. Beatrice's whispers about her barrenness, the subtle campaign to isolate her. And now, this. The perfectly executed lie. Alistair had not questioned it. He had not defended her. He had not even considered her innocence. He had accepted the lie because it fit the narrative Beatrice had so carefully constructed. The disappointing, unfaithful wife. Nausea, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. But it was not the sickness of her pregnancy. It was the sickness of betrayal. A cold, profound shock settled over her, numbing the pain, replacing it with a strange and terrible calm. She did not wait for him to cast her out. She turned and fled back up the silent staircase, a ghost in her own home. There was no time for tears. There was no room for grief. There was only the child, and the fierce, primal need to get it away from this house of lies. In her room, she moved with a methodical, unnatural quiet. She did not look at the opulent furniture, the silks and velvets, the glittering array of jewels on her dressing table. They were part of a life that was no longer hers. They belonged to the Duchess of Blackwood, and the Duchess of Blackwood had just died in the hall outside the library. She stripped off her evening gown, leaving it in a shimmering heap on the floor. She dressed in her plainest traveling suit, a sturdy dress of dark gray wool. She packed a small valise with a change of linen and a few practical items. Her hands moved automatically, her mind a cold, clear engine of calculation. Where to go? She had no family to turn to. Her parents were gone, and her only sibling, a brother, was serving with his regiment in India. She was utterly alone. The thought should have terrified her, but it did not. It was simply a fact. Money. She had a small cache of her own, money from her dowry that she had insisted on controlling herself. It was not much, but it was enough. She retrieved the notes from a locked box in her wardrobe. Her eyes fell on her jewel case. The Blackwood diamonds glittered, cold and mocking. She slammed the lid shut. She would take nothing that belonged to him, nothing except the one thing he had already disowned. Her hand went to a small, simple box on her nightstand. Inside, nestled on worn velvet, was a small gold locket. He had given it to her during their courtship, on a day when they had walked in the rain and laughed, his ducal persona momentarily forgotten. It was a memory of a man who perhaps had never truly existed. Still, she could not bring herself to leave it. It was the only proof that she had not imagined that brief, hopeful time. She fastened it around her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her dress where its cool weight was a secret against her skin. She wrote no note. There was nothing left to say. Using a servant's staircase at the back of the house, she slipped out into the gardens. The rain that had been threatening earlier had begun to fall, a cold, steady drizzle that soaked her bonnet and chilled her to the bone. It washed the scent of lilies and beeswax from the air, replacing it with the clean, honest smell of wet earth and stone. She did not look back at the grand, imposing edifice of Blackwood Manor, its windows blazing with light. She walked through the gates and down the long, dark drive, a lone figure moving towards an unknown future. The Duchess of Blackwood was gone. In her place was only Eleonora, a woman with nothing but a few banknotes, a secret locket, and an even more precious secret growing within her. And she was free. The next 5 years were a lifetime. Eleonora became Ellen Croft. The name felt plain and sturdy in her mouth, a name for a woman who worked with her hands. She found her way to a small, wind-whipped fishing village on the Cornish coast called Port Carenza, a place so remote it seemed to have been forgotten by the rest of the world. It was a place of granite cliffs, churning gray seas, and relentless, salt-laced wind. Her first winter was the hardest. Her money dwindled faster than she had anticipated. The cold was a constant, seeping ache in her bones. She found a room in the house of the village midwife, a stern but not unkind widow named Mrs. Gable. To earn her keep, Eleonora took in mending, her fine, aristocratic stitches a source of wonder to the fishermen's wives. She learned to scrub floors, to gut fish, to haul water from the village pump. Her soft hands became chapped and calloused. The physical exhaustion was a blessing, a heavy blanket that smothered the memories of her past life. When her time came, it was Mrs. Gable who saw her through the long, terrifying night. She gave birth to a son in the small, clean room overlooking the harbor, the sound of the crashing waves a constant roar outside the window. He was small, but healthy, with a thatch of dark hair and eyes that were a startling, familiar shade of gray. Alistair's eyes. She named him Thomas, a simple, strong name. Tom. He became the center of her universe, the sun around which her harsh, new life revolved. Her love for him was a fierce, protective thing, a fire that warmed her against the cold of her loneliness. She moved into a tiny stone cottage of her own, perched on the edge of the cliff. It was little more than 2 rooms, the air perpetually damp, the wind a constant moan at the door. But it was hers. She filled it with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, the sound of her own, quiet humming, and a little boy's laughter. She made a life for them, a small, fiercely guarded world of two. The villagers accepted her. She was quiet, she was respectable, she worked hard. Mrs. Croft was a widow, they assumed, a lady who had fallen on hard times. They did not ask questions. In Port Carenza, everyone had their own ghosts. It was impolite to pry. She rarely thought of Alistair, or rather, she trained herself not to. Sometimes, in the dead of night, his face would rise unbidden in her memory, his cold voice echoing in the darkness. Bastard. The words still had the power to make her flinch, but then she would look at her sleeping son, his face so peaceful in the moonlight, and the anger would recede, replaced by a steely resolve. She had done the right thing. She had saved him. Meanwhile, at Blackwood Manor, silence reigned. Alistair had woken the morning after Eleonora's departure to an empty room and a chillingly neat bed. There was no note, just an absence, a void where she was supposed to be. His aunt had been triumphant. "She has fled to her lover, no doubt," Beatrice had declared. "Good riddance. The scandal will be contained. We will say she has gone to the continent for her health." For a time, Alistair had believed it. He had thrown himself into his duties, his days a rigid schedule of estate business and political maneuverings. He hosted soirees and dinners, his aunt presiding as the de facto duchess, a position she relished. But the victory was hollow. The vast, echoing rooms of Blackwood felt emptier than ever. The silence was a presence, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He had expected relief. Instead, he found a profound, unshakable misery. The memory of Eleonora's face when he had first courted her, so open, so full of quiet intelligence, haunted him. He remembered her laughter, a rare and precious sound he had not heard in a long time, even before the end. The seed of doubt was planted nearly 2 years after she left. He was clearing out a seldom-used desk and found a forgotten portfolio. Inside was a collection of sketches by Julian Sterling, the artist. Tucked within the portfolio was a thin stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. They were the letters Eleonora had exchanged with the artist before their marriage. He read them, his heart pounding. They were exactly as she would have described them, had she been given the chance. Polite, professional. They discussed art, composition, and the possibility of a portrait of her father. There was nothing of stolen moments, or a love that defies convention. They were utterly, devastatingly innocent. He stood in the dusty room, the real letters in one hand, the memory of the forgeries burning in his mind. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool, so easily manipulated by his own pride and his aunt's ambition. He had condemned his wife without a trial, without a single question. The realization was not a sudden crash, but a slow, sickening descent into a pit of self-loathing. He saw Beatrice's machinations with new, horrified eyes, her subtle digs at Eleonora, her constant presence, her web of influence. He had allowed it. He had welcomed it. From that day on, a new, cold purpose settled over him. His aunt saw the change in him and grew wary. He became even more remote, but now there was a dangerous stillness about him, a watchfulness she could not penetrate. He hired a man, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient investigator from London named Mr. Sharp. The instructions were simple. First, find the man who had forged the letters. Second, find the Duchess of Blackwood. It took 3 more years. The forger was tracked down to a debtor's prison, a pathetic creature who confessed everything for a small sum, naming Lady Beatrice as his employer. Mr. Sharp's report was concise and damning. Finding Eleonora was harder. She had vanished without a trace. Alistair began to despair, haunted by visions of her sick or dead in a ditch, her name unknown. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in his gut. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Mr. Sharp arrived at Blackwood. He was a small, neat man who seemed to fade into the background. He laid a single sheet of paper on Alistair's desk. Port Carenza, Cornwall, the investigator said. She lives as a Mrs. Ellen Croft. There is a child, a boy, nearly 5 years old. Alistair stared at the paper, the words blurring before his eyes. A boy, 5 years old. The timeline was perfect. His son. The son he had disowned before he was even born. A wave of shame and a fierce, desperate hope washed over him in equal measure. He did not hesitate. He gave his staff instructions that he was traveling on urgent business. He did not inform his aunt where he was going. He rode for 2 days, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion, the name of a Cornish fishing village a frantic prayer on his lips. Port Carenza was even more rustic and windswept than he had imagined. It smelled of salt and fish and wood smoke. The people stared at his fine clothes and his exhausted, expensive horse with open curiosity. He took a room at the only inn, a place called the Weary Traveler, its floors uneven, the air thick with the smell of stale ale. He asked the innkeeper where he might find Mrs. Croft. The man gave him a guarded look. She keeps to herself, the widow Croft. He pointed. The small cottage on the west cliff, the one with the blue door. Alistair walked. His heart hammered against his ribs. The path was narrow and muddy. And then he saw it. A tiny stone cottage, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The garden was small but neat, filled with late-blooming flowers and hardy vegetables. And then he saw her. She was in the garden, hanging laundry on a line. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her face. She was not wearing silks or jewels. She wore a simple, faded blue dress and a thick woolen shawl. Her hands, the hands he remembered being so soft and pale, were red and chapped. She looked older, thinner, but there was a strength in her face he had never seen before, a resilience forged in hardship. She had not seen him. He stood, hidden by a bend in the path, his breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever remembered. Then the blue door of the cottage opened, and a little boy ran out. He had a tangle of dark hair and a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He ran straight to Eleonora, laughing, and wrapped his arms around her legs. She bent down and swept him up into her arms, her face transformed by a smile of pure, unadulterated love. And the boy turned his head. He looked over his mother's shoulder, his gaze curious, and Alistair found himself staring into his own eyes. The same stormy gray, the same thick lashes. There was no doubt. There was no possibility of doubt. This was his son. The sight broke something in him. The last wall of his pride, his ducal arrogance, crumbled into dust. He had done this. He had thrown this woman and his own child out into the world to fend for themselves. The enormity of his crime was a physical weight, and his knees felt weak. He took a step forward, onto the path. The crunch of his boot on the gravel made her look up. Her smile vanished. Her body went rigid, her arms tightening around the boy. Her face became a pale, cold mask. It was a look he knew well. It was the look she had worn for the last 6 months of their life together. "Eleonora," he breathed. Her name felt foreign in his mouth. She said nothing. She simply stared at him, her gray eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrible anger. The boy in her arms squirmed, sensing his mother's tension. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked. Her voice was not the soft murmur he remembered. It was low and rough, scraped raw by the sea wind and years of disuse. "I came to find you," he said, taking another step. "You have found me," she replied, her tone flat and dismissive. "Now you can leave." She turned to go back into the cottage, her back a rigid line of rejection. "Please," he said, the word torn from him. "Eleonora, I know everything." She stopped, but did not turn. "You know nothing." "Beatrice," he said, his voice urgent. "The letters were forgeries. She hired a man. I have his confession. I was a fool, a blind, Arrogant fool. I never should have believed her. She slowly turned back to face him. There was no softness in her expression, no hint of forgiveness, only a deep, bone-weary cynicism. You believed her because it was what you wanted to believe, that I had failed you, that I was unworthy. No, he insisted, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. He knew she was right. You condemned me, she said, her voice trembling with a fury that had been suppressed for 5 long years. You condemned your own child. She hugged the boy tighter, as if to shield him from the poison of the past. This is Tom, she said, her chin high. My son. Our son, Alistair corrected, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at the boy, who was now staring at him with wide, solemn gray eyes. His heart ached with a love so fierce and painful it was almost unbearable. What is his name? His full name? His name is Thomas Croft, she said, each word a deliberate blow. He has my name, the only one he has ever needed. The rejection was absolute. He had expected anger, but he had not been prepared for this impenetrable wall of ice. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He would explain, she would weep, he would hold her. He was a fool in his imaginings, too. I am not leaving, he said, his own resolve hardening. This would not be solved in a single conversation. He had inflicted a wound that was 5 years deep. It would take more than a confession to heal it. I am not leaving Port Corensa without you, and without my son. He is not your son, she shot back, her voice venomous. You gave up that right 5 years ago, in a library, with a lie. You have no rights here. She turned then, and without another word, carried the boy into the cottage and shut the blue door firmly in his face. The click of the latch was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He was left alone on the cliff path, with the wail of the gulls and the crushing weight of his own failure. Alistair did not try the door again. He stood for a long time, staring at the weathered blue paint, before turning and walking back to the inn. He knew what Eleonora had said was true. He had no rights here. Rights were for dukes and landowners. They meant nothing to a woman he had so profoundly wronged. He would have to earn them. His first instinct was the one he always fell back on: power and wealth. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He could solve this. He sent a message back to London via a frantic series of couriers. Within a week, a carriage arrived in Port Corensa, a sight so grand the entire village turned out to stare. It brought Mr. Davies, a gentle, scholarly man who had been one of Alistair's own tutors as a boy. It also brought a large, polished trunk. Alistair had Mr. Davies deliver a message to the cottage. He did not go himself. He was giving her space, he told himself, though it felt more like cowardice. The message stated that Mr. Davies was there to begin the boy's education, as was befitting the son of a duke. The trunk contained clothes, books, and a breathtaking array of finely crafted toys: miniature soldiers, a wooden horse, a clockwork train. He was trying to build a bridge, but he was using the wrong materials. He was trying to buy his way back into a life he had thrown away. He waited at the inn, pacing the uneven floorboards of his small room. The salt air did not smell clean to him. It smelled of his own failure. He imagined Tom's delight at the toys, Eleonora's reluctant admission that he was providing for his son. He was wrong. Mr. Davies returned late in the afternoon. He looked troubled. He was not carrying the empty trunk. He was carrying a single, folded piece of paper. Her Grace, forgive me, Mrs. Croft, was not receptive, Your Grace, the tutor said quietly. She said the boy needs no tutor. As for the trunk, she said you should give the toys to the village children. Alistair's jaw tightened. And the boy? Did you see him? I did, Mr. Davies said. He is a bright, curious child. He sent this for you. The tutor held out the piece of paper. Alistair took it. It was a child's drawing, done in charcoal on a rough piece of paper. The lines were simple and stark. It was a picture of a house, a small cottage with a blue door, perched on a cliff above a scribbled sea. In the doorway stood two figures. One was clearly a woman with long hair. The other was a small boy holding her hand. The sun shone above them. The garden was full of lopsided flowers. It was a picture of a complete, self-contained world. There was no one else in the drawing. There was no man, no father, no duke. There was no empty space waiting to be filled. The drawing was not an invitation. It was a statement. This is my home. This is my whole home. Alistair sank into a chair, the drawing clutched in his hand. The simple, brutal honesty of it struck him more forcefully than any of Eleonora's angry words. He could not force his way into that picture. He could not buy a space in it with tutors and toys. The Duke of Blackwood had no place there. Perhaps, he thought, a man named Alistair might. He had to change his approach entirely. The next morning he walked not to Eleonora's cottage, but to the small, bustling harbor. A storm the night before had damaged a section of the old seawall, and the fishermen were surveying it with grim faces. Their livelihoods depended on it. Alistair approached the oldest of them, a man with a face like a weathered map. "Forgive me," Alistair said, shedding the ducal tone he had used his entire life. "I have some experience with engineering and stonework from my own estates. Perhaps I could be of some use." The men looked him up and down, taking in his fine, though now travel-worn clothes. They were suspicious. But Alistair did not command them. He asked. He listened to their concerns, his head bent against the wind. He sketched a design for the repair in the sand with a piece of driftwood, incorporating their knowledge of the local tides and currents. He spoke of leverage and foundations, not as a duke giving orders, but as a man offering a solution. And then he offered to pay for the stone, and the extra hands needed to do the work, drawing on the funds he had with him. He did not announce it as a gift from the Duke of Blackwood. He presented it as a contribution from a visitor who wished the village well. He spent the next week at the harbor, not overseeing, but working. He shed his fine coat for a borrowed fisherman's sweater. He hauled stones. He mixed mortar. His hands, soft and manicured, became blistered, then calloused, mirroring the change that had happened to Eleonora's. The villagers' suspicion slowly turned to a grudging respect. They started calling him Alistair, not your lordship. He saw Eleonora from a distance. She would come to the market, her basket on her arm, Tom trotting at her side. She saw him working. He could feel her eyes on him. She did not approach, but she watched. One evening he returned to the inn, exhausted and aching, to find a small package on his table. It was a pot of salve for his hands. There was no note, but he knew who it was from. It was the first crack in the wall of ice. He continued his quiet campaign. He learned from the innkeeper that the village had no proper doctor, only Mrs. Gable's midwifery and herbal remedies. He sent another message, and a young capable doctor from a nearby town was hired, a retainer paid from Alistair's accounts, to visit Port Carenza twice a week. He did not tell Eleonora he was doing these things. He simply did them. He was not trying to impress her. He was trying to atone. He was trying to become a man worthy of being in her world, not drag her back into his. The proof he needed against his aunt arrived with Mr. Sharp a week later. It was not just the forger's confession anymore. It was a sworn statement from Julian Sterling, expressing his outrage at the misuse of his name. It was corroboration from two of Beatrice's former maids, who had overheard her plotting and had been dismissed under false pretenses. It was a web of evidence so tight it was irrefutable. He took the papers and walked to the cottage with the blue door. It was evening. A lamp glowed in the window. He knocked softly. She opened the door. She looked tired. Her eyes went from his face to the papers in his hand. She did not invite him in. "I am not here to make excuses," he said, his voice quiet. "Excuses are for men who believe they are not at fault. I am at fault. I was weak and proud, and I failed you in every way a man can fail his wife. But I want you to know the truth of the conspiracy against you." He held out the papers. "This is the proof of my foolishness and of my aunt's malice." She hesitated, then took the folder. She stood in the doorway, reading the pages one by one under the light from the lamp. He watched her face. He saw the flicker of old pain, the confirmation of a betrayal she had long suspected. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. "She will be dealt with," he said. "I will see her ruined. She will never have power over anyone again." "And that is supposed to fix it?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Her ruin does not give me back the last 5 years. It does not erase the nights I lay awake, terrified, wondering how I would feed my son. It does not erase the fact that you, my husband, believed I was a whore." Every word was true. Every word was a lash he deserved. "No," he said, his voice raw. "Nothing can fix it. Nothing can erase it. All I can do is stand here and tell you that I am sorry, and that I will spend the rest of my life, however you will let me, trying to make amends." From inside the cottage, a small voice called out, "Mama, is the man going away?" Tom appeared in the doorway behind her, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He looked at Alistair with the same solemn curiosity as before. Eleonora put a protective hand on her son's shoulder. She looked from Alistair's face, etched with exhaustion and regret, to the papers in her hand, to the sleeping village behind him. "The wind is cold," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You should come inside." The inside of the cottage was small and spare, but it was warm and clean. A fire crackled in the hearth. A simple stew simmered on the hob, filling the room with the scent of thyme and onions. Tom's wooden toys, carved by a local fisherman, were piled neatly in a corner. It was a home, the home from the drawing. Alistair stepped over the threshold, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. He had never felt so large and out of place in his life. The low ceiling forced him to stoop slightly. Eleonora gestured to a small wooden chair by the fire. "Sit." It was not an invitation, so much as a command. He sat. Tom hid behind his mother's skirts, peering out at him. "Mama made a salve for your hands," the boy said suddenly, his voice piping and clear. Eleonora's cheeks colored slightly. "Tom, go and get ready for bed." "But the man is here," he protested. "His name is Alistair," Eleonora said softly, looking not at her son, but at the Duke. It was the first time she had used his name. Alistair's heart clenched. He looked at his son. "Hello, Tom," he said, his voice hoarse. Tom considered him for a long moment. "Your eyes are like mine." The simple, childlike observation hung in the air between them, a truth more powerful than any legal document. "Yes," Alistair managed to say. "They are." Eleonora busied herself putting Tom to bed in the small adjoining room, a process that involved a story and a softly sung lullaby. Alistair sat by the fire, listening to the quiet domestic sounds, a world he had never known. The ache in his chest was overwhelming. This was what he had thrown away. This peace. This love. When she returned, she did not sit. She stood by the mantel, the folder of evidence resting beside a chipped porcelain vase of wildflowers. "Why did you fix the seawall?" she asked, her arms crossed over her chest. "It needed fixing," he answered simply. "And the doctor?" "The village needed a doctor." "You did not have to do those things." "Yes," he said, looking up at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I did. I have spent my life using my name and my money to get what I want. I wanted to use them to do something good, with no expectation of reward." He paused. "I did not do it for you. I did it for me, to try and become a man who deserved to ask for your forgiveness." She was silent for a long time, her expression thoughtful. The fire popped and hissed, the only sound in the room. "Forgiveness is not a single act, Alistair," she said finally. "It is not a debt that can be paid and then forgotten. I do not know if I can forgive you for what you did." She took a deep breath. "But I have seen what you have done. Here, in this village. The man who hauled stones from the harbor is not the same man who listened to his aunt's poison." She looked tired, so incredibly tired. The fight was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. "I do not want to hate you anymore," she whispered. "It is exhausting." That night, a fever took hold of Tom. It came on suddenly, as fevers in children do. He woke crying, his body hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Eleonora, who had faced poverty and loneliness with stoic resolve, was seized by a raw, primal terror. She was bathing his forehead with a cool cloth when there was a soft knock on the connecting door to the main room. She had offered Alistair the floor by the fire for the night, unable to send him back out into the cold, stormy darkness. The door opened. Alistair stood there, his shirt rumpled, his hair disheveled from a fitful sleep. "I heard him cry out," he said. "What is it?" "A fever," she said, her voice tight with fear. "He is burning up." Without a word, Alistair was at her side. He touched Tom's forehead with the back of his hand, his expression grim. "We need to get the doctor." "He is in the next town," Eleonora cried, her composure cracking. "It would take hours." "Then we will manage until he can be fetched at dawn," Alistair said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of panic. "Tell me what to do." For the rest of the night, they were a team. He fetched fresh, cool water from the pump outside, shielding the bucket from the driving rain. He held Tom when he cried, his large, gentle hands surprisingly competent. He spoke in low, soothing tones, telling the boy rambling stories about horses and castles. Eleonora sat by the bedside, changing the cool compresses, her fear a hard knot in her stomach. She watched Alistair. He was not a duke. He was a father, terrified for his son. In the dim, flickering lamplight, she saw the lines of exhaustion and worry etched on his face. He met her gaze across the small bed, and in his eyes she saw not guilt or a desire for atonement, but a shared, simple fear, a shared love for the small boy between them. Towards dawn, the fever broke. Tom's skin grew cool and damp, and his breathing evened out into the deep, peaceful rhythm of sleep. Eleonora sagged with relief, tears she had not allowed herself to shed, finally tracking down her cheeks. Alistair reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pull a blanket around her shoulders. "He will be well," Alistair said softly. She nodded, unable to speak. They sat in silence, two sentinels guarding their sleeping son, as the first gray light of morning crept through the window. In that shared, silent vigil, something fundamental had shifted. The anger and bitterness that had been her shield for 5 years had been washed away by the tide of a greater fear, and what was left was a fragile, aching vulnerability. Alistair left at first light to ensure the doctor was sent for, just in case. When he returned, Tom was awake and asking for breakfast. His color returned. Eleonora was in the main room, stoking the fire. She looked up as he entered. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of the night they had just passed. "I would do anything for him," Alistair said. "And for you." He did not press her. He did not ask for anything. He simply accepted her thanks and took a seat by the fire, a quiet, reassuring presence. Later that day, she found him on the cliff path, staring out at the turbulent sea. She came and stood beside him, pulling her shawl tighter against the wind. "I am returning to London tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "To deal with Beatrice. I will strip her of her position, her allowance, her place in society. I will see her name removed from every invitation list, and her presence erased from my life. It is the last act of the old life I need to conclude." Eleonora was silent for a moment. "And then?" "And then," he said, finally turning to face her, "I will come back here. I will take a room at the inn for as long as you will allow it. I will be whatever you want me to be. A visitor, a friend, a father to Tom if you will let me. I will not ask for more." She looked at his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a humble, aching sincerity. She saw the man who had worked on the sea wall, the man who had sat through the night by their son's sickbed. "Blackwood must be very grand," she said, her voice quiet. "It is a cold, empty house," he replied. "It is not a home." She thought of the drawing Tom had made, the small cottage, the two figures, a complete world. But a world can grow. It can make room. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it could be a home, if it were filled with the right things, not just furniture and titles, with laughter, and with a boy's toys." Hope, bright and terrifying, dawned in his eyes. "Eleonora?" "You will go to London," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You will do what you must, and when you are finished, you will not come back here. You will send for us, for me and for your son, Thomas Beaumont." She was not the Duchess of Blackwood, cowering in a ballroom. She was not Ellen Croft, hiding from the world. She was Eleonora, and she was choosing her future. "We will return to Blackwood," she continued, "but on new terms. I will not be a decoration. I will be your partner. I want to use the Blackwood resources to start a foundation, a place to help women who find themselves alone and without recourse. Women like me." He stared at her, his expression one of awe. "Anything," he said, his voice thick. "Whatever you wish. It is all yours." "No," she corrected him gently. "It will be ours." He reached out then, and his calloused hand closed over hers. His touch was not demanding, but a question, a promise. She did not pull away. The day they left Port Carenza, the entire village came to see them off. Mrs. Gable hugged Eleonora tightly, pressing a small bag of dried lavender into her hand. "You be happy now, my dear," the old woman whispered. Alistair shook hands with the fisherman, who clapped him on the back. Tom was perched on his father's shoulders, waving a solemn goodbye. The journey back to Blackwood was the reverse of the one Eleonora had made 5 years earlier. She was not fleeing in darkness and rain, but returning in the bright autumn sun. When the grand facade of Blackwood Manor came into view, she felt a flicker of the old dread, but then Alistair's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady. The house had been transformed. The heavy, oppressive draperies were gone, replaced with lighter fabrics that let in the sun. The scent of lilies was gone, replaced by the clean smell of beeswax and fresh air. Lady Beatrice was gone, exiled to a remote country estate in disgrace, her name a poison no one in society would touch. The staff was new, hired by Alistair's man of business. They greeted their Duchess with respectful, curious eyes. That first evening, after Tom was asleep in a magnificent nursery filled with every toy a boy could dream of, Alistair led Eleonora into the library. It was the same room where he had condemned her. A fire burned brightly in the hearth. On the mantel, in a simple silver frame, was Tom's charcoal drawing of the cottage with the blue door. "So I never forget," Alistair said softly. "What a home truly is." He did not try to kiss her. He did not press his advantage. He simply stood with her, watching the flames, sharing the quiet of the room. The silence was different now. It was not a void, but a comfortable, peaceful space between them. In the weeks that followed, he courted her. He, the Duke of Blackwood, courted his own wife. He brought her tea in the mornings. They walked the grounds together, not in silence, but talking for hours, filling in the 5 lost years. He listened, truly listened to her ideas for her foundation. The rebuilding of their life was a slow, deliberate process. It was built not on duty or expectation, but on small acts of service, on shared laughter, on the earned, quiet trust that grew between them. One afternoon, she found him on the floor of the nursery, on his hands and knees. Tom was directing him in a complicated battle with his toy soldiers. Alistair's cravat was askew, his hair was mussed, and he was laughing, a deep, genuine sound that echoed in the vast room. Eleonora leaned against the doorframe, a soft smile on her face. She held the old gold locket in her hand, its surface worn smooth by years of anxious touch. She no longer needed it as a reminder of a man who might have been. The real man was here, on the floor, being defeated by a 5-year-old general. The house was no longer a cage. The drawing was no longer a lament. It was a foundation, and they were finally, truly, home.